Welcome everyone to our first of a series of Take 5 soil series, I guess, and we're talking about cover crops. I'm gonna let Tori take it away and explain what the soil network is.
Yeah, the soil network is a farmer-led network where we connect and support farmers in Ontario under the common objective of improving Ontario's soils. The types of resources that farmers are able to tap into and then bring back to their communities in whatever way their community needs are training, access to research, networking opportunities, as well as a whole slew of other things that you can amass when you are a network. Yeah, we have an exciting series of events ahead of us to kind of bring us into being as we become an official nonprofit and seek partnership with a lot of fun organizations that that I'm sure you've interacted with before.
Excellent. And we've got this is just the first of 4, so you'll see the relay cropping compaction strips of all kinds. That's not what you think it is. It's like strip till, bio strips, and all things strips. And these Let's Talk Soil online are very, very small chats just with like a really focused topic with just a few growers. So you really get that peer-to-peer learning. And that's all going to be a sign up online on the Ontario Soil Network website, but also we'll be sending it to you right after this call so you can sign up then if you want to just keep talking about it. So let's just dive right into it. The whole point of this Take 5 was just like, it's rapid fire. We're going to do a quick presentation right back to back to back of 5 farmers, 5 cover croppers, and then you're going to have an opportunity to ask questions afterwards. We're going to open it up. So to start, this is where they're all coming from. We've got a binational conference here going on with Tim in Michigan. And to start, we're looking with Dr. Dave Hooker from Ridgetown. He's an research agronomist and associate professor at the University of Guelph Ridgetown campus. He also farms just south of London as well. So he's going to be talking about the research trials that they've done, and his takeaway is don't rush the long game. So Dave, can you open it up and take it away?
All right. So good evening, everybody. It's just a pleasure to be here today, this evening. And I'm just sensing that everybody's in a little bit better mood these days than they were last week. I think most fields received some rain, and it just seems to pick up everybody's mood. And if you have not received very much rain, I guess maybe you're in a little bit worse mood. And so extra blessings to you, I guess, during these times. First of all, I just love, I guess, talking about the farm, and I love to talk about my research because the two of them go hand in hand. And so one of my favorite projects is the crop rotation projects that we have, and one is in Elora, and this one was managed by Dr. Bill Dean, my colleague, and the other one is in the lower right corner, is an overview of the Ridgetown site. And I just love to talk about these, and of course these dovetail nicely within the cover crop talk because each one of these involves a system, a cropping system, and cover crops, of course, is a system. It's part of the system, an important part of the system, and today we're going to focus on cover crops, obviously. But one of the things that I'm really excited about, or have been really excited about these long-term plots, is that we've had questions, lots of questions, and we've heard of, like myself, I've documented visually better cropping, I guess, responses due to crop rotation and tillage. I've seen that, but we need to quantify those things. And so both of these long-term locations have had like a kind of a minor cover crop role. We mainly focused on tillage and crop rotation. But we have some major outcomes of these, and just the next slide, please. And the major outcome is that wheat in the rotation increases corn yields by 6 to 17 bushel per acre, just depending on the tillage system, and soybean 4 to 6 bushel per acre. So this is common across both Elora and Ridgetown, 2 different environments, 2 different soil types. And so this is very important, of course, for the wheat component of the enterprise, because it's the wheat component, I think, that has the highest potential to deliver the highest, I guess, benefits of service crops within that, or just right after the wheat. It could be, red clover underseeding, but mostly that's that cover crop growth in the 3 or 4 months that follow winter wheat crop that has the greatest potential, I think, of any crop. And of course, if you don't have wheat in the rotation, it's very difficult to establish a cover crop and get as much biomass and root mass or nitrogen fixing, those kinds of benefits. So wheat in rotation, we know that it has increases organic matter and reduces dependence on fertilizer nitrogen. If we underseed red clover into winter wheat, our data suggests 6 bushel more corn. And that's over and above what the benefit would be for nitrogen fertilizer. And I know Dan has some good data as well, and so I'm looking forward to hearing Dan's responses, or the response of red clover in Dan's operation as well. We know that crop rotation diversity increases resilience in stress conditions, and so again, cover crops and winter wheat fit nicely into that. And we know that crop rotation is really more important than tillage system. And that's a pretty generalized statement, but in general, crop rotation is more important than the tillage system. So we have good data that supports that as well. But again, we need to be thinking of a systems approach. All right, so next slide. So that was the long-term rotation trial, tillage trial, and 3 years ago, some colleagues, myself and some colleagues, started this long-term cover crop because, of course, the big question is, okay, we've got good answers in long-term rotation and long-term tillage, long-term nitrogen use, but the question is, what do cover crops bring in the long term? And so this trial is really focused on field crops and what different cover crop intensities, what they can bring to the crop rotation. Okay, next slide, please. So this is just one little tidbit, I guess, of information or a little bit of data that we've extracted from the 3 years. And so this is after wheat, different cover crop options after wheat. And we have red clover, and we have just under 1,500 kilograms per hectare, or about 1,500 pounds per acre of above ground biomass with red clover. Of course, there's root biomass that we're not accounting for. There's nitrogen, but a lot of the success due to cover crops is due to how much biomass is produced. And just to get an idea of how much biomass is produced, one can look at the above ground biomass. But of course, the root biomass differs as well, just depending on the species. But just looking at the above ground biomass, red clover, about 1,500 pounds to the acre. But as you notice that oat, a 3-way species mix, and a 10-way species mix, all have about the same biomass production. And so this is quite common, actually, in the scientific literature. It's very difficult to say that the 3-way or the multi-species mixes are advantageous over, let's say, a monoculture species of a cover crop. But that's just looking, at the above ground biomass. You can argue, hey, considering the root as well, maybe this might paint a different picture, or maybe your cover crop objectives, whatever objectives you want to achieve with the cover crops, maybe the multi-species would favor that. Well, the multi-species would kind of favor those kinds of objectives. But another point here is that adding nitrogen, fertilizer nitrogen after wheat, if the ground is limited in nitrogen content, you can either apply manure or fertilizer nitrogen. As you can see, we have 50% more above ground biomass where we've applied 50 pounds to the acre of nitrogen after wheat harvest. And I think this is quite significant. And I've seen farm fields as well even in my own farm, that if I did not apply, if the cover crop is short of nitrogen, we just don't get very much biomass out of that cover crop. And if there was a little bit of legume in that cover crop, it just does not provide enough nitrogen, I guess, transfer to those non-leguminous species in that mix. So it can be argued, of course, these data can be argued, but in general, you want the nutrients to be there if that nutrient is, if a specific nutrient is limiting cover crop growth. All right, next slide, please. So this is what I've done on the farm last year. I started, Dan will get into red clover, his passion for red clover. And I also have an incredible passion for red clover as well. I think it is extremely valuable. We have the most data of any cover crop species on red clover. But I've been frustrated just with the spatial variability with red clover in my farm with high wheat yields, and it's just spatial variability is concerned, and I might have some perennial sow thistle that is difficult to control because I want to leave red clover as late as possible, and maybe it's too late in order to achieve good perennial sow thistle control. So last year I tried this multi-species mix, and it worked out very well for me. And the picture on the left is a picture in early, it was seeded after wheat, of course, and this was a picture in late August, and then the upper right is late September, and then right after snowfall is in the bottom right. And to me, to my eyes, there's no better picture than a green cover after a freshly fallen snow cover. It's just there's something about that I just love, and I know also that the soil microbiology is happy with that scenario as well. All right, I think that's my last slide.
Indeed.
Thank you.
Thank you, Dave. Online clap for everyone. So next up, we've got Dan Pecker. Dan is, thanks, story, calling in from Port Rowan, Ontario. He farms right by the lake. Very involved in agriculture, as you can see. And he has been, I guess you'll see when he turns this video on, you can see he's been growing cover crops longer than he's been growing that beard.
Video.
There you go. Dan's a numbers guy, and he's going to be talking the numbers about red clover. And his takeaway is keeping it simple pays too. So take it away, Dan.
Hi, everyone. Let's go to the next slide right away. Our initial approaches for cover crops are to stop our soil from eroding and moving away. And our biggest, weakest point in our rotation of corn, beans, wheat, and some hay is the soybeans. And we have lots of surface erosion. And our cheap and effective way to deal with this is broadcasting oats or cereal rye or any cheap small grain around Labor Day weekend into standing soybeans. And you can see on the left, there's just that's probably about a week before harvest. The cutter knife will go right through that. We won't even have an issue. We just grow crusher beans, so I don't care about staining. On the right, that would be what the field looks like when we are harvesting it. And next slide, really quick. This is what it would be January 1st. We have a full field scale waterway. There's about 500-600 acres of water come teeming down this 300 yard wide field. And normally I have to fill that in every spring. So there is a cost-effective savings because I'm not doing 2 or 3 passes of spring tillage to fill in those ruts and those washouts. So that's one way we quantify our small expense of broadcasting oats. Next slide. So clover is my favorite cover crop. It is old school awesome. We have tried all sorts of ways to make it work, and our initial was make our wheat rows wider. So we played with 20s and 10s, and I still play with 7.5s. And we can still be consistent because we've upped our rate of red clover to about 12 pounds an acre consistently. We increased our sulfur addition in the springtime when we top dress because legumes love clover, especially these ones. And we've also changed some of our herbicide programs 3 years in advance leading into the wheat field. Next slide, please. So that is in a 7.5 inch row. That was taken I don't know, sometime in the spring, because it was a perfect spring for legumes, those legumes. My biggest question, I always get asked this as well, is what's the end credit worth? We typically believe 25 to 35 pounds. Let's see what the numbers tell us if it's worth leveraging. Next slide, please. This slide's a little bit busy, but if you look on the left-hand side, you'll see red clover. I charge myself $5 an acre to go spread it, 12 pounds at $2. So there's roughly $30. There's our end credit range in the middle. Here are this is my equivalent units of, or how much gallons of 28 or 32 UAN I need. And there's my per acre cost of this year's money. So right there, the end credit value is actually worth a negative amount. If I ignore the end credit, you look at the bottom half of that slide, wherever I plant corn, we have this in trials, wherever I have corn following the red clover, ignoring the end credit, we're consistently 15 bushel, well, that's 25 bushel there. So we're having a net value gain after all our costs previous of $96 an acre. The clover does amazing things, and that's why we keep efforting it to make it work. Next slide, please. So where clover doesn't work sometimes, we plant buckwheat, and lots of it. What you'll see here, this is a biostrip attempt. We strip buckwheat in between our red clover, and when that dies, we will just plant the corn crop into there. The nice thing about buckwheat is it acts as a tillage pass, so now there's an expense of applying it and buying it, but if I can replace a tillage pass or two in the spring, then I'm still spending the same dollars, but just more wisely. Next slide, please. So buckwheat will suppress wireworm. Its shallow roots act as very aggressive tillage, and the beekeepers come, when they see a field of buckwheat and red clover, they come like crazy, and they'll pay you instead of us renting hives. If you see on that little bottom right picture, that is a clay soil, a CEC about 19. It is falling apart. It is amazing what buckwheat will do to those heavier clays. It's just a matter of timing and getting it in and getting that little trench closed. That seed needs to be direct seeded. And I think that's me.
Yep, that's it. Thanks, Dan. And I want to open it up to just to Dave Hooker to just ask a question. Usually, if we were all in person, which I desperately miss, Dave would be the first one to ask a question. And it's usually, where's the data? Dave, do you have any quick question for Dan? Or any comment?
It sounds like I'm kind of a troll or something.
Oh, no, in a good way. It's a good way.
All right, so Dan, you have really awesome numbers there, and I was just going to ask. I wanted to ask you. You know, I mentioned that in my presentation, I'm a little bit frustrated with my experience with red clover.
Yep.
You know, it works one year and not another. Variability across the field. And have you experienced that? And that is, and is that the reason why you are interplanting buckwheat, for instance, after? Like if a state is there.
Yeah, our biggest issue this year was we just lost our frost too quick. So I have 300 acres of wheat that has nothing under it. We've kind of compensated from the overwintering issues by upping our rate significantly. Like we have high yielding wheat, but a lot of guys I see are still 4, 5, 6 pounds. We double it, and we've gotten rid of certain group 2s on our crops, and we've noticed a better clover catch because of it. Yeah. Group 2s that are important in IP beans, unfortunately.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I have been going with 6 pounds, and maybe I need to reconsider that.
It's just money.
Higher rate. And your twin row wheat, is that, or skip row wheat, is that common across all of your wheat acreage? And do you experience any wheat yield loss because you're going to skip row?
Well, that is that wheat is planted rather than drilled, so we use a 1790 center fill. Right. We made our own plates. We haven't had any yield loss. If in fact we've actually bumped our yields up by about 5%, contrary to what a lot of the data will say. And I think it's from consistent placement. When you say 1.25 inches or 1.5 inches, it is always there.
All right. That's it for me.
Excellent. Thanks. Next, we're going to move on to Sarah Wood. She farms with her family in Mitchell, Ontario. Also very involved in agriculture, a busy lady. And Sarah's going to talk about starting with your exit plan. So take it away, Sarah.
Thanks, Mel. So next slide. Perfect, thanks. What is your exit plan? So when we got into cover crops, we didn't think about our exit plan when we first started. And this left us frustrated come the fall, come the spring of the next year when we were ready to plant our corn. It's an objective that we can eliminate, a problem we can deal with. So the way we started to look at our cover crop is we want to plan our exit before we pick what we put in our cover crop mix. We want to know how comfortable, what's your comfort level? Because if you're too stressed, you're not going to enjoy it and you're going to be discouraged really quickly. So pick what your comfort level is and then go from there. So next slide. So for us, we see three options in our program. So we're either going to plant green, and that leaves us with changing the way we set up our planter, which isn't a problem. It just requires fine tuning depending on the year. Or we're going to spray it down, either fall spray or spring spray, whatever is left. Or we're going to tillage, whether you're going to plow it under, cultivate it, disc it. That bottom photo is the strips that we were ripping that corn went into this year. That's only spring strips. We don't fall strip it. And most of the stuff is dead in that photo. Now we had another field, same mix. The tillage radish survived and we had to go in and spray. So have a backup plan to your plan because the best laid plan doesn't always work. So next slide. So once you have that, let's talk about your goal. So is it capturing nitrogen? Is it building organic matter? Are we trying to smother out troubled weeds that are causing you without using a chemical alternative? Or are you trying cover crop because it's the trendy thing to do? For us, our main goal is we're capturing the nitrogen that would be left in the soil, and we're trying to build the organic matter. So we farm with no animal manure from our operation. We have started to work with some local neighbors that are willing to switch straw for manure. So that's been a benefit to us, but it's also how we plan our rotation. So our goal is capture that nitrogen, build the organic matter, leave the soil healthier than what we started with so that our son, if he cares to take over the farm, has a better start. So next. So then here's a sample of our mix. So now that you have your exit strategy, your backup plan to your exit strategy, and what your goal is, then start to look at the different mixes. Figure out whether you need something that's winter kills, whether you're comfortable enough to leave something till the spring. If you are, what's your plan and strategy if it gets too big? And then start to work on what you want to start with. So when we started, it was oats and barley. And then we started to play with some tillage radish. And we learned the hard way, don't go more than 1 or 2 pounds because it can cause a lot of problems. The picture on the right, you'll see, has multiple different species in there. That is not the cover crop blend that's on your screen. There are 2 different ones. So just so if you're looking at it and you're not confused. So right now we're using a mixture of black and yellow forage peas, some spring triticale, some tillage radish, purple top turnip. We threw that into the mix. It's interesting. Don't go to the field in the spring when it's all starting to rot. It smells horrible. But some oats and barley. So for us, it's all about simple. What's our exit plan so that no one's stressed come spring? Spring can be stressful enough, and let's take that burden off of you.
Excellent. That's Sarah. Thank you so much. Dave, do you want to chime in?
Yeah, I'll ask another question. I just noticed that you had you talked about your strip till a little bit, and do you find that strip tillage reduces some of the potential, I guess, risks involved with, let's say, planting green or a matter residue on the surface in the spring? Do you think strip till reduces some of that risk?
So for us, it has. So when we first started, we didn't have a strip tiller and I was planting green, not on purpose, but by accident one year because we didn't get it sprayed down in time. It was challenging. It was hard to cut through, even though our planter is set up for it. So we have down forest, it's all tripped out. The strip tiller has allowed us to cut through that mat that's rather thick come spring, but that mat's also eliminating maybe a pass of a chemical spray. It's smothering the weeds. So we just strip it and then a day later plant right into it. So for us, it's been a way of working through the process. It's not the be and end all. It's not where we want to be at the end. We'd like to go back to planting green. But as we get started, it's a way for us to work through the system because it's a system.
Right. All right, thank you.
I always joke that Sarah was the first no-till queen of the furrow. Next up, we've got Andy Van Eekirk coming in from Stayner, Ontario. Andy has been, he farms, but he's also been an agri-coach for many years. So he's also working on other people's farms. So Andy's been no-till or conservation till and no-till for 15 years. And he says it's because he never really learned how to plow. But that the labor and the fuel savings, he said, might make him look like a lazy farmer. But Andy is far from lazy if you've seen him around. So Andy, take it away.
Thank you, Mel. I never thought of myself as a lazy farmer. It's really just to reduce the number of passes that I have in my land, and that's where my aim is, just to reduce passes. So after no-tilling for 15 years or so, I've been 4 years I've been planting green, and that's in an effort to improve my soil microbiology and really to reduce erosion, because I've seen a lot of erosion on straight no-till fields, believe it or not, because of the lack of root mass in the growing furrow there. So one thing I believe and I've learned is that no-till and cover crops need to go hand in hand, in my opinion. I didn't see the improvement in the soil after as much as after 15 years of no-till as I have now with 4 years of planting green. And so planting green is really just a planter setup. It's just row cleaners or a straight coulter that will cut through the residue. You need to have good down pressure on your planter or drill, whether that's hydraulic or spring mounted down pressure. You need to have seed firmers and firming wheels. And in my opinion, spike closing wheels are a must because of the difference in soil moisture. You tend to get better seed to soil contact. From that. Next slide, please. Mel. So this is a picture of my first experience planting green in 2016. And the way I got started with that, as I just asked my custom sprayer, and it was burnt off 2 weeks before planting. I just asked him to turn off the center boom on the sprayer, and that's where I started. So I started planting there, and as I got closer to this planting green, my heart started palpitating, and I started getting anxiety going through, because it was everything your dad told you not to do. But this was a real learning experience. It wasn't the best one I've ever done, but I did have a crop. I had reduced population. It was in white beans, so that's probably the most difficult crop to plant green into. But you can see that we did have a crop, and we had a lot of residue in between the rows there, and so I was pretty happy with it. So that's kind of what I was pretty happy with that. So it's relative success. So it allowed me to learn a lot on that. So next slide, please. So fast forward into this year, I planted corn May 14th into my backfield, and there was I planted May 14th, and I sprayed it with Assure and 2,4-D the next day. And I knew that Assure was a little slower to act than this glyphosate. So I was patient, and finally I just had to call it. So on June 2nd, to the field to the upper right there, that's what it looked like. I was getting pretty worried, and so there was an issue with my sprayer at that the spray tank at that time. I'm not exactly sure. There's really a lot of chemical antagonism between the Assure and the 2,4-D. So on June 6th, I called it, and I just gave it a good spray with glyphosate, which it was Roundup Ready corn, just as a back of. So like your double disc opener there will cut through a green root just as easily as it will a 2-week-old dead root. So there's no reason why that can't be done. So as you can see on the bottom right hand side, that was July 3rd. You can see the corn was well on its way to making crop, and the considerable residue in between the rows there. That crop now is over my head now, so I'm pretty happy with that. Next slide, please. So this is another one that I had done last year. This is actually we were planting soybean inoculant trials for a company who wanted us to trial their soybean inoculant, and it was a wetter year, so we didn't get started till May 29th. But it was kind of in that in between stage where we couldn't really crimp it because it wasn't tall enough, and so but we needed to get these plots planted, so we just planted right through it, and there wasn't really an issue really planting with your correct amount of down pressure. And as you can see, I sprayed 2 or 3 days afterwards. And as you can see, Dave Hume's in the field taking plant stands there, and you can see the difference in color there. After a while, you can see on the bottom right there, all the residue had settled right down and matted down. So it really wasn't an issue after things got established. And you can see this was an inoculant trial, and in center of the page there was our control. So that one had no inoculant, so we were pretty happy with that. So when it's not tall enough to crimp yet, there is a bit of a shading effect, but it doesn't last very long, in my opinion. In fact, I've seen better stands sometimes from just planting straight rather than rolled. So next slide, please. So the next slide is where I use my crimper, and this is where it was really late, really wet, and so we let the rye go, and this was just before flowering, so it was probably 4.5 feet tall, and so the crimper was able to do a really good job of crimping it down. And I was using this is planting soybeans with a corn planter in 30-inch rows. And so, which it makes for a very pretty field. It's not quite as hairy as you will if you leave it. So it makes for good weed control. I did actually respray this afterwards just to get some of the weeds that escaped through that thatch. And so yeah, so the later you plant, the more likely you'll need the front crimper, really. So next slide, please, Mel. So this next slide is where on the upper right-hand side is where I planted in 7.5-inch rows with my 1590 drill. And it was a day after I planted the corn, so it was probably, the rye was probably 6 to 7 inches tall. And unfortunately, I had a lot of other crops to plant afterwards, and I didn't spray the burn down until May 30th. So it looked extremely hairy. Like if that bothers you, you shouldn't be doing it. But I was pretty happy with it, and that field looks it's rock and rolling now. It's a pretty good looking field now, because all the residue is kind of underneath the top growth of the soybeans. For the livestock folks, I've tried cutting and baling just to see what it did, and tremendous amount of forage off of that. We wet baled it, and so it made really good feed. And it was a lot easier no-till planting and a lot more normal type of planting, but it was a lot less soil armor on the ground. When we had a pounding rain, I could see there was considerable soil degradation in that strip than there was where we had a lot of residue on top that protected the soil. And and then the bottom left picture is one of my favorite cover crop pictures. Crimson clover is such a pretty plant, and it's such a useful plant as well. So that's my presentation now.
Excellent. Thank you, Andy. Dave, do you have a quick comment for our last presenter?
Yes, I do. Andy, have you you seem to be quite successful in planting green, and I know that there's some risks involved. And so, what are some of the risks that you run into, and how do you manage those risks? So I'm thinking maybe termination issues, or if it's too wet or too dry in the spring. How do you manage those?
Well, you have to kind of look at the long-term forecast for one thing, and if you think it's going to be dry, you should be terminating it early. Right. I've generally used it as a way to dry up fields, honestly, because rye sucks a lot of moisture out of the ground, and if you're not careful, it can suck up almost too much moisture. So that's really when to terminate. And I manage that by planting earlier corn so I base it on the soil conditions. If the soil conditions are ready to plant, I ignore my cover crop. I just and because I'm not trying to use it as total weed suppression, I spray it out, and so I'm not an organic farmer, so that's kind of where my position is. Plant when the planting conditions and the soil is proper, not necessarily when the cover crop is ready.
Yeah, that's great. I like how your management strategies are flexible. So you don't follow a strict recipe. You seem to be flexible according to whatever Mother Nature brings to the year.
Part of being a farmer, isn't it?
Yeah, that's right. It is. Indeed.
Excellent.
Thank you.
Thank you. So our last presenter, lastly but not leastly, Tim Boring's from Stockbridge, Michigan, on a 6th-generation farm there. He's also really involved in the Michigan Agribusiness Association, has his PhD and has been a researcher with Michigan State University. And he's on the cutting edge of innovation. You've probably seen him on Twitter. If you don't follow him, you definitely should. There's a lot to be learned from Tim. So thank you so much for joining us. And I guess he's got a great presentation on setting the cover crop up for success. So take it away, Tim.
Well, hopefully there's a lot to learn of not repeating all the mistakes and failures I've made on things. So flattered to be involved here and sharing a little bit about where I've come along with. I finally feel like I'm in a place where I've kind of got this interseeding covers into corn thing, at least working for me. Plenty of room for improvement, but better than I've been in the past. So this is a photo here from last week of one of my fields. As you can see, that we've got a pretty good catch of different mixes here. So, but that's kind of been a multi-year process to get to this point. So next slide. I have really started playing around with interseeding in maybe 2016. And these are a couple of photos from where we've been over the last few years. And in these photos, we were still side dressing dry urea on with Monte Cart. and really trying to combine operations of interseeding covers at the same time that we were applying urea. And we've tried a number of different things. We've tried blending cover crops in with the urea, so we're just blowing it all down as one mix. It's not specifically shown here. We've tried mounting some Gandy boxes on this rig to do either over the row kind of or in between the rows to just get something going. And with the idea here that those coulters that come through that are on that side dresser are going to do a little incorporation. And we've even mounted a small ATV spreader on the front of the tractor just to figure out if that might be a viable path forward. Frankly, none of this worked very well. And our part of the world over here, we're in pretty light textured soils anyway, and we always seem to be heading into kind of a flash drought in June, July. So the weather certainly hasn't helped in the past few years. But it really, for us, kind of became this question. We weren't getting good seed to soil contact, and we just couldn't ensure a very consistent stand. So next slide. What has worked a lot better then is actually moving back to a planter unit and specifically planting these covers and ensuring that we're getting good seed to soil contact, covering the seed up a little bit, and actually getting it in the ground. So this rig doubles as our relay crop planter as well. These units had been on a pull type planter last year, and we moved them over to a 3-point bar this year. One of the things that I really like about going with a setup like this is we can specifically place seed depth differently for large seeded covers through those traditional seed boxes versus the small seeded stuff through the insecticide boxes. So we're independently metering those two out, and those hoses then out of those insecticide units are routing down kind of between the closing wheels. We're not doing a great job then of shallow placing a lot of that seed, but it has worked pretty well. We've got vacuum plates on here from Seed Right that are just kind of bulk cover crop seed plates. This has worked pretty well for us. So next slide. Questions with how you're going to do all this then really comes back to herbicides then. And I've got a list of all the different things we've tried here. I've been really happy with where we came out this last year with our herbicide programs. And running a little bit lower rate of some of these products too, and counting on some of our soil biology to chew through some of the residual nature of these products then, so we can get something planted behind them. Certainly you look down here, some of the ones I've tried in the past. On fields with really low weed pressure in the first place, running glyphosate and glufosinate works pretty well, very low residual of those. But the rest of all these, we've struggled to some extent of getting a full blend of cover crops up through them. If you're just going to shoot for grasses or just legumes or brassicas, that becomes a lot easier. But when you run these diverse blends, it becomes more of a challenge. So next slide. This is an example of one of the blends we ran this year. I'm a subscriber to this Rick Bieber concept. I know Rick talked in London here a couple of years ago at the Innovative Farmers meeting of trying to exploit some of these different niches out in the system. So I want a couple different species of a cool season grass, a warm season grass, cool season broadleaf, warm season broadleaf, with the idea that in any given year, we're not necessarily going to have open niches, that the weather's not going to cooperate or herbicides won't be right. Not everything's going to take. So I want multiple things out there at low rates so they can remain somewhat affordable, but so that we're setting ourselves up for the most likely, the highest likelihood that we're actually going to have something take in the field and we'll have something out there. This is expensive. I'm still at the point of I'm kind of playing around with some of these different species and figuring out what's going to work best for us. And hopefully in the future we can cut out some of these species that don't consistently work for us. Mm-hmm. And finally, I'll just touch on a little bit here of thinking ahead and how this works within a systems approach. A lot of this all works, but you have to kind of stitch all these different pieces together to make everything work. So this was a field going into black beans for us this year. So obviously a later planting date, and we could get a little bit more size in that cover crop. And you can see some of the things that held on through the winter here. So there's annual rye in there, hairy vetch, clovers, rape. Next slide. So it is nice having a little bit more growth on these. If you're trying to plant the end of April, there's not much green up there. But when you are coming in late, I I mean, we're interseeding these covers in between our twin rows of corn. So the challenge becomes, and Sarah alluded to this a little bit with strip till and how you make some of these different things work. You're going to be planting right into that cover crop strip next year. And it does require a little bit different setup on the planter, and it requires some thinking ahead on these sorts of things. You can see that the left-hand slide is out planting this year, and the right-hand slide is the aftermath of that. The planter did a pretty good job of shredding through everything. But if you are going to be running in a strip till situation, running annual rye through a strip till is not always the easiest thing to do. So depending on your tillage situation, what you're trying to do here, it's worthwhile thinking ahead then of what those root structures look like the next year and how you're going to kind of make this work within your broader system and how everything comes together. So I think that's my last slide, and
excellent.
I guess we can move into the next portion here.
Yep.
If Dave has any questions.
Well, yeah, no, we'll let let Dave ask the first question.
All right, so in that last slide, you showed your planter going through some, look like a lot of annual rye, ryegrass. And so how did you terminate the annual ryegrass in that scenario?
So that's a good question. I've never had much trouble terminating annual rye until this year in that field there. And a couple of things. In the past that I've used, there's a lot of times if I'm running in these corn mixes with a fair amount of annual rye, I'm coming in with a hefty pre-program of glyphosate, usually Sharpen is in there, and I'm going to rattle off American trade names here.
We'll translate them to Canadian.
But dual some metribuzin in there. And I've never really had a problem knocking annual rye back. This year, I specifically dropped glyphosate out of that herbicide mix because I wanted to be able to say these black beans have never had glyphosate on them. Pure marketing, kind of just checking the boxes on these sorts of things. Gramoxin didn't burn this stuff back very well. I think part of the problem is, too, that I shredded up that residue so much early on, there wasn't a whole lot of leaf surface issue there for herbicides to latch onto later. So it's on the edge for me of a concerning amount of rye in some of these dry bean rows. I don't know whether that's going to be really a problem. The beans aren't flowering yet. I don't know if I'm going to see a yield hit from it. I like the fact that I still have some really straggly, crappy looking rye out there. It's holding on, but it's probably building some soil quality while I'm out there at the same time. So I'm kind of on the edge of how concerned I need to be about it right now. It's probably gonna go to seed. But again, I mean, I'm not terribly opposed to the idea of a few of these cover crops reseeding themselves out there if we can control them later.
Yeah, interesting. In Ontario, a lot of growers have gone away from annual ryegrass just because it gets difficult to control, especially if it starts to get into head or stem elongation, as this is well into. It's just a major control issue, and plus there's a resistance potential as well. And so a lot of growers have kind of shied away from annual ryegrass.
I hear a lot of talk about that too. I love what it does for root bunching and some of the soil quality attributes it can have. And I've never really run into much problems with it before this year. So it'll still probably be a part of what I do. But if anything, as I move to some of these kind of more diverse mixes, and I should mention too, I mean, it's interesting some of your data there of the single species or the limited species blends can still put on just as much biomass. I think there's something to this piece too of getting diversity out there and just stimulating this general soil biology. So I'm a fan of putting lots of things out there at pretty low rates. So even if I guess we have a situation where we've got some tough to control annual rye, there's just not much of it out there to really cause too much of a problem.
All right, thank you.
Good point, Tim. Thanks. And now we're going to open up to all of you for questions. Obviously, these are our 5 takeaways, but you're welcome to take whatever you wanted from the presentation. Here's the contact information of all of our speakers. This is not the end. This is just still the beginning. We're going to open it up. You're welcome to unmute yourself and ask a question, or there's been a bit of discussion already happening in the chat box. So you're welcome to ask a question there. And then, Tori, if you want to read a question or two. Do you want to make a note if you want to get some CEU credits from this? just email ann.verhollen@ontario.ca with your number, and then she'll make sure that you get the credits. So yeah, take it away. I guess, did anyone have a question? We'll just got a few minutes here before we're going to go into breakout rooms with just really small groups to have a little bit more of a discussion.
One of the questions that came up that that some of the speakers were able to answer in the chat room, but certainly it would be helpful for everyone to answer, is does anyone have issues with residue at harvest, or maybe what are some of the management techniques for dealing with that as an issue?
Yeah. Any one of our speakers?
I can chime in a little bit there, Tori. When I this one particular field that I had got custom done, I specifically asked, I said, did you notice any difference with that? And he says, actually, I find it slides along the ground better with the rye residue underneath the skid plates of the flex head. So, and this is referring obviously to soybeans. There's actually a positive response there. There might be a little more residue go through the combine. I don't think that's an issue, in my opinion.
Anyone else from our speakers?
That's okay, because I have more.
Yeah. There's more questions.
Yeah, of course. I actually have 3 banked. Slugs. There was definitely a question about slugs. I think specifically maybe to Andy.
Yeah.
But let's all talk about slugs.
Let's talk about slugs. Tim, do you have slugs? Do you have American slugs?
Slugs.
No,
searching for my mute button.
Yeah, no kidding.
You know, the folks down in Pennsylvania, kind of south of Lake Erie, they seem to have a lot of problems with them. We don't have many slug problems here in Michigan, so we've been lucky that way.
Is that a soil type thing, Tim, you think?
That's probably a lot of it. I mean, we're on sandy loams or muck soils.
Yeah.
And those mucks especially stay pretty wet. They're going to freeze up pretty hard in the winter. Our soil types probably have a lot to do with it.
I used to have more problems with slugs just in straight no-till situations. And I think that the later terminating ryegrass, they're still chewing away at that stuff and allows your beans and corn to get ahead while that's happening. I think, anyways.
Andy, I've heard the same thing as well. With other things that slugs can chew on, it will leave the corn and soybeans alone. I think anything else that you can do to improve early crop growth, it can stay ahead of any slug damage, and I think that's important as well.
Yeah, and I think the fact that we're trying not to spray as much insecticide there, I think we're creating more predators in underneath the canopy there, and I think they're just feeding on the slugs as well. That's part of the equation, not the entire equation, but it's part of it anyways.
Well, and one of the lessons I picked up from the folks in Pennsylvania too is they tended to run into a lot of these slug problems when they terminated everything a fair while ahead of planting.
Yeah.
Right. So that you're planting in the brown situations and that green crop comes up.
Yeah.
We're doing an awful lot of delayed termination to the point of, well, I know a lot of the folks here probably don't have crop insurance requirements the same way we do, but to the point where we're skirting the termination guidelines within our crop insurance requirements. And maybe that's a part of it too, where we don't have so much slug problems. The slugs aren't going to just feast on those seedlings coming up because there's still some green things still out there in the field.
Yeah, I would agree, Tim.
Okay, I'm going to field.
Margaret was concerned that no one understood we were talking about slugs, like the not sluts. Just to be clear, everyone, that's what we were talking about. The little creepy crawlies.
So to move on to another question from Tyler, how rigid is all of your crop rotation planning?
Good question.
Ours is set probably 2 or 3 years out, and like last year we had to put that on hold, and we put a lot of corn on corn and some soybeans on soybean ground. So it's planned for, but every year will kind of really determine what you can do. So it makes some of the herbicide options from the year before, if you want to make covers work, makes it tough.
I would tend to look at what I have in there for weeds. We had a problem with tufted vetch here, and so I've been targeting some of the Banville products there. That 7.5-inch row soybean field that you saw on the last slide there had actually a lot of tufted vetch in it, so that was actually dicamba resistant beans, and that was in my burn down was glyphosate and dicamba, and so it looks after them nicely there. So you have to be careful of what weed spectrum you have in there. If you got some tough weeds in there, it's definitely not a good idea going to edible beans, that required that type of harder chemical.
Yeah, so for us, crop rotation is pretty strict. We're wheat, corn, soybeans. Our soybeans are all identity preserved beans that are going to Hensel and then off to Japan for soy milk. Unless there is a major wheat issue, we're going to try to stick to that crop rotation, and we've seen huge benefits with that. Now, our cover crop goes in right after wheat, and we try to push that as long as there's some rain in the forecast. It's going in, chasing the combine out.
Mine is incredibly fluid. Keep moving more away from the traditional staple crops of corn and soybeans. And my challenge is, too, that we're responding to some extent within the market and some new opportunities for crops as they come up. But I'm typically going to have 2 or 3 5-acre blocks of kind of a trial crop in any given year. So this year we're playing around with some sunflowers. I've got a few acres of red corn out. Oats we're experimenting. And depending on how any of those crops might go, we might significantly increase the acreage next year. We did that with blacks last year. We went from a few acres of black beans up to a pretty decent chunk of our bean rotation acreage. It makes herbicide rotation restrictions pretty challenging, but we're all no-till, try to be all plant green here. I want as little residual herbicide out there as possible, and the more biology that we tend to have in these soils, the more residue, the better we're seeming to get along with that, even though we've got some challenging weeds like horseweed, mare's tail, things like that. So for me, it's really a flexible thing of I have no idea what my crop rotations are going to look like next year. And it certainly becomes kind of a challenge then to blend some of those market potentials for different crops and what we've got going out there this year between cover crop blends and herbicides and things like that to try to set things up for next year.
Next question.
Yeah.
Okay, great. There's a ton of them, and just cut me off for the breakouts whenever.
Yeah, let's give it another 5 minutes or so, and then we're going to move to the next portion.
Great. So the next question is, what is the best mixture for underseeding corn?
I don't know.
No.
I do know that cereal rye does not like to grow much in that environment with all the shading. I've had good luck with oats. More than anything, I want crops that are going to still be green next spring. And on pretty well, and will start greening up and looking pretty good the next spring. My hairy vetch looked really good this year, and I've been a little hesitant in the past to do much with hairy vetch, but I like the way that looks. There's always some clovers that tend to come out there. I've had poor luck with radishes or turnips. Rape tends to make it through pretty well too. And I'm not sure how much those brassicas are really doing for soil health, but there's plenty of flowers out there, and the pollinators love them next year. Buckwheat kind of is hit or miss on some of the soil moisture. It doesn't love a lot of competition. So I don't have a lot of great answers on it, but a few things to stay away from I know are cereal rye.
So Tim, is your major rotation that you're talking about here, is it like corn and bean? Is that the major two crop system?
Yeah, corn and soybeans are our major crops. We're trying to work more wheat into the rotation, small grains. Yeah. So we've got some oats, barley, rye, but wheat's been the big one for us. A little bit of it is we're on about a third of our ground is high organic matter muck ground, and I'd love to get an overwintering cereal on those acres as well, but it's been a little bit more challenging.
Yeah, I'm very interested. I'm very intrigued of your two-depth planter system. We notice in our multi-species plots, in my research plots, where the small seeds tend to be too deep, and then you try to shallow the drill out, and then the bigger seeds are too shallow. Then it's hard to find a happy medium there.
There's more to play around with it, I think, too, of closing wheel setups. Just kind of smooth, round, conventional tillage closing wheels. I played around a little bit with some Dawn curve tines this year, and I hated them for how much soil disturbance they did on my relay crop soybeans. But in an intercrop situation like that, if maybe they're blending in that little seed into that soil profile a little bit, there might be some potential there as well.
Yeah, great points.
Mm-hmm. One last one, maybe, Tori?
Sure. Oh gosh, there's so many.
I like Brett's about the livestock. That's a new one, or?
Yeah. Any plans on integrating livestock?
I have a finishing hog barn there, which I am still finding challenges there. I find the best way that I've had was I used a drag hose system in about the first or second week in October into standing rye, into standing cover crop, and I found that to be as good as anything, really. Yeah, you lose a little bit of the ammonia portion of the manure, but if your cover crop is thick enough, it stays in place. I'm just toying with different ideas, and you're always compromising the loss of some nitrogen in your wheat if you're not tilling. So that's kind of. We used an injection type of system last year, which burned the snot out of the bottom leaves of the corn. And I was actually relatively happy with that. I got to do a few twigs on that, but the headlands were a write-off after that. So got to figure something else out after that. But that's actually one of the most satisfying one is doing injection in crop. It's an expensive way of spreading manure, but it may compensate with better use of your nitrogen. I didn't put any 28% side dress on. That was my my side dressing activity there. So that's where I allotted those funds, that money to. So that actually worked as good. Fortunately, I don't have my own narrow roads manure spreader, but so I had to get that custom done. But still thinking that one through.
Yeah. Has anyone else put manure out with the cover crops? No.
So
we always put manure on our red clover, so it's just part of the program now.
Right. Sarah?
yeah, and for us, manure is going on once the cover crop's in the ground and planted. We try to get it on before the cover crop's up so we're not trampling as much of the cover crop. The other thing is we're getting a bio pellet that's a registered fertilizer out of Toronto. It's also going on, so we're trying to help it as much as possible, but none of that is intended for extra growth in the cover crop. It's all intended for the next year.
In terms of the other questions, have they all been answered? At least someone's put a reply. I think, Dave, there was a question specific to you about what species you plant in your cover crop mix after winter wheat. I don't know if you want to just quick answer that question or reply to it in the chat box. To Kate.
I could just quickly reply.
Yeah.
So right after wheat, about a week after harvesting wheat, 30 pounds of oats, 1 pound of tillage radish, 2 pounds of sunflower, and 20 pounds of forage peas.
Were you writing that down? Thanks, everyone. I'm sorry we couldn't get to all the questions, but please take note of all their contact information to ask them follow-up questions. And this is always